Well, hey BCM, I'm so glad that you could join tonight as we have come and gathered to begin our study in the book of Esther. I just want to begin by saying that I hope that you're off to a great semester. I know things are crazy right now and you're experiencing things you probably never thought you would, but I do pray for y'all, and I pray that your semester is at least headed in a positive direction in that sense. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Becnel, and I am the associate pastor at Westside Baptist Church. I focus specifically as well on ministering to the college and young adults at our church. Matt asked me a few weeks ago if I would be willing to bring a message from Esther chapter 1, and so that's what we're going to be today. So if you have your Bibles, would you please take those and start turning with me to Esther chapter 1. And as you're turning there, I was told that you have already been introduced to the book of Esther, and you've already kind of overviewed its contents. And so you probably already know the big idea and the flow of the story and what happens throughout the story. It's a pretty incredible story, the book of Esther. But you also probably already know one of the distinguishing aspects about this book is that it's considered, quote, godless. And so there's no mention of God anywhere. There's not really even an allusion to God in this book. And so it's interesting in that it's the only book like that in all of the Bible. And so as we come and as we begin studying Esther chapter 1, we have to ask ourselves, how do we encounter God here without twisting and changing or adding something into the text? Because we certainly do not want to do so. But as many have noted, and as you hopefully already know, though God's not mentioned in this text, He's all over this text. He's all over this text. And so the way I think we approach this book, and really all books, but specifically this one and every chapter in this book, is we need to have an idea of what the big picture is, the main idea of the story in this picture, or in this Bible. In this book, Esther. And so the book of Esther is what we call a narrative. It's kind of like a story or a play. It has scenes in it, and the author is telling a story. He's trying to communicate something, and the entire story of Esther serves a purpose, and it's to communicate how the Jews survived a most evil threat. How the Jews survived the most evil threat, and hopefully you already perhaps know that. I'm not going to try and steal anybody's thunder in future messages, so I'm going to be a little vague with some of the things I say, but it's how the Jews survive a most evil threat. And because of their survival, because of their deliverance, the Jews remember this experience through a festival. And so the book also tells us the origin of a festival in which they celebrate. And so it's with that I think we need to keep that in mind as we read chapter 1 and all the chapters to understand exactly what's happening. There's another thing that I want to just get clear as we begin studying this, and we got to have a correct understanding of God when we read this book in particular. God is sovereign, and God is also providential in His care in the universe. And so these are two attributes of God that are important. Some of them are controversial, but they're important especially as we read Esther, because even though God's not mentioned, like I said, He's all over this, and we see traces of His sovereignty and of His providence all over the text. And so let me explain what I mean by that. Sovereignty is essentially God's how He expresses His rule over His creation. He's created all things in the universe. He is in control over all things in the universe. And sovereignty just explains that God is able to express control over all things because He has created all things. Providence is a little more specific, but it kind of is getting at the same aspect. And providence is a doctrine of God that explains how He is continually involved in all things. He's continually involved in all things, and He's cooperating with the things that He has created in their actions and in their decisions and in their properties, and He's moving in a way to fulfill His purposes. And that is what I mean by God's providence. So it's really completely contrary to the idea that the universe is just something that has happened by mistake or by chance or by fate. Sovereignty and providence say that God is in control and that He is moving and working in a way to fulfill specific purposes that He has set out. And so I think that's important as we read this text and as we come to it and understand it, because the events that happen in chapter 1 and really throughout the entire book of Esther, the events that happen here can only be explained by God's sovereignty and in His providence. Some of the things that happened should not have happened, but yet they did, and the only way we can explain it is because God is sovereign and He is providential in His care. And so all of this begins back in the beginning of Esther chapter 1, and I'm going to take time to read the entire first chapter. I'm going to break it into 2 sections, so it's going to be a little lengthy, but follow along with me as best as you can, and then we'll explain a little bit about what's going on. So follow along with me beginning in Esther chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll read through verse 9. This is what we read. These events took place during the days of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Cush. In those days the king reigned from his royal throne in the fortress of Susa. He held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all of his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles, and all the officials from the provinces. He displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness for a total of 180 days. At the end of this time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present in the fortress of Susa. White and violet linen hangings were fastened with fine white, purple, and linen cords to silver rods on marble columns. Gold and silver couches were arranged on a mosaic pavement of red feldspar, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in an array of gold goblets, each with a different design. Royal wine flowed freely according to the king's bounty. The drinking was according to royal decree, which said there are no restrictions. The king had ordered every wine steward in his household to serve whatever each person wanted. King Vashti also gave a feast for the women of King Ahasuerus' palace. And so that's verses 1 through 9. And what's going on there? What's the story that the author is trying to tell us? And it's pretty clear that the opening scene here, if you want to think about this as a play, the opening scene has been organized and crafted in such a way that the author is trying to help us see the power and the prosperity and the prominence of this king. King Ahasuerus is probably better known by his Greek spelling of his name. You probably have heard this before, but King Xerxes. This is the same man, and Xerxes is actually pretty famous in history. He has been a character in a number of books and plays and movies and even video games. And so if you've ever seen the movie 300 with the Spartans and the 300 Spartans, and they're battling the Persians, and the king in that movie is Xerxes. And if you haven't seen that movie, it's not particularly wholesome, so I'm not going to recommend it. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we remember this man even today for his remarkable power, his prosperity, and his prominence. And that's what the author is, I think, setting us up to see as well. And so what we see is a huge party taking place. It's a festival that's lasted for 180 days, and for which the invitations were given and extended to, the text says, all of his officials, all of the staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and the officials from all the provinces. So this is a huge, extravagant celebration, festival with seemingly massive numbers of people in attendance. 2 armies are at this party celebrating the king. But it gets even more extravagant, and hopefully you saw this in the text, but at the end of this 180 days, at the end of this 180 days, another party is thrown, a feast, a banquet that lasts for 7 days, and the invitations are extended to all the people from the greatest to the least. And so this is just insane what is happening right now. And hopefully you get the picture, but it's like 187 days of of Mardi Gras, if you could ever even fathom that. It's even bigger and more boisterous than what we would see in Mardi Gras today. It's even more sinful than what we would see as well. Look at what the text says about alcohol. He says that the consumption of alcohol was essentially rivaled, something to be rivaled. The king issued a law that said there are no restrictions on the boozing. And so this is insane what's happening here, but it's pretty sad what's happening here. It's pretty godless what is happening here. The book is starting off godless and it's going to continue godless, but the sins of this man and this kingdom, specifically this man, they're absurd. And in his great power and in his great prominence, he's also greatly disillusioned and he's greatly disconnected from reality. So if you have a few moments when you're in your small groups, I want you to look at verses 1 through 9 and really kind of pick out some of the things that you see about this king, because though this celebration was being thrown for him, everything was being done for him, it also, everything that happens and everything that takes place was initiated by him. He was doing it for himself, and he was organizing it and putting it into play by himself. And so it's kind of weird because this man who's so great and so powerful has to throw his own party. It's kind of weird. People don't throw their own birthday parties even, and this isn't even a birthday party. If someone threw their own birthday party, it'd be a little weird, but this isn't even a birthday party. This is just to show his splendor and his majesty and his greatness. And the kingdom isn't throwing it, he's throwing it. So it's just, he's so consumed in himself and so absurd. But it's in his absurdness that the king sends to a completely different level, but also it's what God begins to use to display his sovereignty and his providential care for his people. It's through this that God's providence is beginning to shape and take place. And if you look intently, it is happening, and we'll explain why. So we're going to continue reading verses 10 through 22, and we'll see that the 7-day celebration kind of comes to a climax, and the king is drunk, and he makes some decisions that sets some events in place that will have lasting impacts. They will ultimately lead to the Jews surviving a most evil threat, a threat that could cause them to become extinct even. So the decisions that he's about to make are extremely important and in some ways unexplainable. But let's read what God's word says. So follow along with me beginning in verse 10. It says, "On the 7th day, when the king was feeling good from wine, Ahasuerus commanded Mahayim, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass." Some interesting names, hard to pronounce, but in any case, these are the 7 eunuchs who personally served him, and he ordered them to bring Queen Vashti before him with her royal crown. He wanted to show off her beauty to the people and the officials because she was very beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command that was delivered by his eunuchs. The king became furious, and his anger burned within him. The king consulted the wise men who understood the times, for it was his normal procedure to confer with experts in law and in justice. The most trusted ones were Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marshina, and Memucan. They were the 7 officials of Persia and Media who had personal access to the king and who occupied the highest positions in the kingdom. So the king asked them, according to the law, what should be done with Queen Vashti, since she has refused to obey the king's command that was delivered by the eunuchs. Verse 16 says that Memucan said in the presence of the king and his officials, "Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but has wronged all the officials and peoples who are in every one of the king's provinces. For the queen's action will become public knowledge to all the women and cause them to despise their husbands and say that King Ahasuerus ordered Queen Vashti brought before him, but she did not come. Before this day is over, the noble women of Persia and Media who hear about the queen's act will say the same thing to all the king's officials, resulting in more contempt and in more fury. If it meets the king's approval, he should personally issue a royal decree. Let it be recorded in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be revoked. Vashti is not to enter King Ahasuerus' presence, and her royal position is to be given to another woman who is more worthy than she. Underline that. It's to be given to another woman more worthy than she. The decree the king issues will be heard throughout the vast kingdom, so all the women will honor their husbands from the greatest to the least. The king and his counselors approved the proposal, and he followed Memucan's advice. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language, that every man should be master of his house and speak in the language of his own people. So a lot of words, a lengthy passage, but again, what is happening here? What is being communicated? So at the height of this second 7-day banquet, the king is drunk. He's feeling good with wine, is what the text says. And he decides that it would be wise to show off his queen, Vashti. And so he's been showing off all of his splendor. He's been showing off all of his wealth for over 180 days. And so it does kind of make sense. Like, this is his queen is his most prized possession in a sense. But we read that she was very beautiful, and that in a sense she was really his most prized possession. But that's really all she was a prized possession. And so Vashti doesn't go, though, when prompted by the king. And we need to ask why. Why did the queen not appear before the king? And really, that's an important question, but nobody knows. Again, it's one of these unexplainable things that happens in this book. We have to understand that the events that are happening right now in chapter 1 take place during a time in history that was very, very different than the time that we're currently living in. Women were not viewed like they were today. They didn't have the rights that they had today. They had very little rights. There was no feminism, and there was no women's equality rights or equality marches. And so the reason I tell you that is because we can't look at the actions of Queen Vashti or even the actions of Esther later on in this letter and start to try and fill in the gaps and explain why is it that they acted as they did. Because truthfully, it's unexplainable. It's unexplainable. Because the reality is that even as queen, Vashti was in no place to decline the king's invitation. Nobody, man or woman, whoever they may be and in whatever position they may be in, was in any sense of an authority to be able to decline the king's invitation. No one refuses the king lest they meet certain death. Yet his wife, Queen Vashti, does it, and no one can fully explain it. And so we again return to God's providential care for his people. It's being seen on display here, quietly, but it's being seen. So his queen declines his invitation, and I got to also point out, this is a little bit ironic what's happening right now, because remember, this is a great, powerful, prominent king with unlimited resources, yet he's not as powerful as we think or as he thinks, because his wife declines his very own requests, and he begins to burn in anger, is what the text says. And in another sense of irony about the king's power and prominence, this great and mighty king doesn't even take matters into his own hands. This great leader doesn't take matters into his own hands. Yet what he does is he's compelled to go to other people to consult with the wise men and the people who understood the times, which I think is a bit of a crack at this man's ego, his reputation. Apparently, the king, is not so wise, and apparently he doesn't understand the times in all of his power and all of his greatness. He doesn't understand any of this enough to make a decision by himself. He has to consult other people. He has to consult other people. His inner cabinet, in a sense, his inner circle. And they're described as being wise. They're described as being experts in law and in justice. And I got to say, those are some pretty awesome descriptions, but they're given to some people who make some pretty idiotic decisions. They seem pretty idiotic. And maybe it's because they're drunk. That's a possibility. But again, some of the things that happen here are unexplainable. Some of the decisions that they come up with to this problem that they have apparently encountered. And I'll be honest, I think they completely blow this out of proportion. Queen Vashti has rebelled against her husband, but I think they make a mountain out of a molehill with this. And maybe that's my modern brain thinking about this, but let's think about what happens here. There's an individual named Memucan, and he concludes that the queen's actions will become public knowledge, that all the women throughout the kingdom are going to end up doing the same thing to the king's officials and to their own husbands when they find out what Vashti has done. And so that's also, again, pretty absurd if you really think about it. Is that really going to become public knowledge that Queen Vashti rebelled? I mean, there might be a few people who know, especially the eunuchs who brought her in, but is it going to become public knowledge to where the women are uncontrollable in the kingdom? And it's in a different time. You know, it's not like he could have tweeted this or videoed it and shown the kingdom. So the reality is, if it even got out, I don't think it would have become a problem like they're saying, but I don't even think it would have gotten out. I don't think that it would have become the problem that they think it's going to become. And so there is, again, another bit of irony in this story so far. So rather than keeping this quiet and preserving the image of the king and trying to keep the peace, they conclude that they should make this event public knowledge by issuing a royal decree about it. It just doesn't make any sense. So they record it in the laws of Persian Media that Vashti, the queen, is not to enter the king's presence. And her royal position is to be given to another woman who is more worthy than she is. Remember that phrase. And so I don't know if you see the absurdity of what's going on, the idiocracy of what's going on, but they're making so much out of this situation. They're making it so much worse. And so it's foolishness what they're concluding, what they're doing. And if you think that it's over, it's not, because they issued a decree and they send it to all the provinces in the kingdom. And they also send it in the language of each of the people so that everybody can understand exactly what it says. And it orders each person, each man, it says that each man should be master of his own house. That's what the law, the decree says. And so if you add all this together, it doesn't take a genius to see how ridiculous this is, but essentially they're telling everybody that the queen is no longer queen because she would not allow the king to be master of his household. And so it's another shot at this king's reputation. And really, too, what is the point of all of their huffing and puffing about what she has done? Again, I'm trying not to come at this with a modern mind, because again, women were in a different position in society at this point in time. And again, this is with the king, so there was some wrong there in a sense, but at the same time, was it really that big of a deal that they had to do all of this? It's not thought out. But again, I think it's in this very thing and the ludicrous decision that they're making that we see God's providence begin to take shape, to be put on play. So the author is setting us up to see man's sinful failures and God's success through his providence and through his sovereignty. Because all of this is happening, I'm not going to spoil future messages, hopefully, but all of this is happening because it's setting us up for Esther to become queen. All of this is taking shape, and it will eventually lead to Esther becoming queen. And That's important. Why is that important? So we return back to that big idea that we began with, the big idea of Esther, in exploring God's providence at work here, even in the ludicrousy of these men and the decisions that they're making. It opens the door for Esther to become queen, which eventually results in the people of God being saved from a most evil threat, a threat that could have potentially placed them in extinction. There would be no more Jews. So what is the point of that? Well, that's important if you're a Jew, right? You don't want your people group to be extinguished from the earth by a most evil threat. So it's obviously important for those of the Jewish faith and those who have been in that regard. But what about in regard to us as Christians? What does this mean for us? And what we got to realize is that the book of Esther is part of a greater story that runs throughout the Bible. It's a story of redemption that begins with Abraham in Genesis and runs all the way through Jesus Christ and affects us as his church today. Since man sinned and rebelled against God in the garden, God has set out to redeem his people through Jesus Christ, and he began that by the covenant he made with Abraham to bless all the peoples of the earth through him. And that would eventually find its fulfillment in Jesus Christ, in the gospel, and make its way to the Christian church. But if God had not preserved his people here through his sovereignty and his providential care, then none of that would happen. The story would have run out here. It would have started with Abraham, but it would have run out here, and we would not have reached Christ. We would not have reached the gospel and the fulfillment that he made for our salvation, for the salvation of his people, for the church. It would have ended. The possibility of ever being in a right relationship with God would have ended here. And so what we see here is that since the fall of man, God's desire, again, has been to provide the redemption of man through Jesus Christ, to give us that possibility of being redeemed through Christ. And here, he would fulfill his desire to continue that through his providence and through his sovereignty, through a wild party, through a marital dispute between a king and his queen, and through a ridiculous decision made by the king's officials to replace the queen. These things don't happen. These things don't happen. They're unexplainable why things are falling into place as they are. But again, it's the quiet display of God's providence that sets up Esther to become queen, which would eventually result in the deliverance of his people from a most evil threat. So an amazing chapter. I'm on the seat of my pants. I want to read the next chapter and see exactly what happens. And hopefully you have already done that. But as we finish this chapter, it's obvious that the story is not over. Remember, there's supposed to be one more worthy than Queen Vashti to take her place. So will that come to pass? Time will tell. Hopefully you will learn in the next message on chapter 2. But let me end with how I think this relates to us as well. As we're at this point in the narrative, just like the narrative of Esther is not over yet, perhaps the narrative for us is not yet over either. Perhaps we are in the midst of our very own story of, like Esther, our very own Esther story, where the world is chaotic and the things that are happening do not make sense. But even now, as in the first chapter of Esther, God is sovereign and God is providential in his care, and he is setting things up for a specific purpose to fulfill his purpose and his will. And so I think the response of chapter 1 of Esther is to trust in the sovereignty and providence of God, because as you will see, everything works out for the good of his people, and it eventually works its way out to the church as well. One of the amazing stories in the redemptive history of the Bible that we see just here beginning, the stage is being set in Esther chapter 1. It's an amazing thing that we've seen here. And I implore you just to continue studying this and to see where is God throughout the story of Esther, because he's there. Again, not explicitly, but he's there. And just like he's there, he's here now among us, among his people, and he's working all things out for the good of those who love him and for those who have been called according to his purposes. And that's comforting. That's comforting to know. God's purposes are good, especially for his people, and we must just trust in his sovereignty and in his providence, even when we don't see it explicitly, even when the world is denying it, we trust in it. And I think that's what we see in Esther chapter 1. And so hopefully I've done some justice here. Hopefully I've pumped you up a little bit for what's going to happen in chapter 2. The irony continues over and over again. The story gets even more crazy, and it is insane what happens throughout this book. But again, it's all a testament to how sovereign and how providential our God is. And so be reading with that in your mind. Don't forget the main purpose of the design of this book, and don't forget God's providence and sovereignty as you study chapter 2 and through chapter 10 as a faith family together. I appreciate you letting me be a part of this. Thank you, Matt, for allowing me to be a part of this. If you have any questions about anything I said, or if you want to know more about why I said something that I said, you can ask Matt, or you can reach out to me. I'll give him my contact information. You can email me or text me or call me, and I'd love to chat with you. But I love each of you, and I'm praying for you as you continue to be lights in a world that is very dark, especially as you're in college. You're going to have opportunities you never will have again. And so I'm praying for you as you just continue in college and in life. Thanks again, and I appreciate everything that y'all have allowed me to do and to take part in. Take care.